we have to have it. The words of Donald Trump as he makes a bid for Greenland. He says he wants the Danish territory for international safety and security. His vice president is visiting the island this week. So why is Trump so fixated on Greenland? And could he take it by force? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Donald Trump has his eyes set on Greenland. The US president says Washington should take over the Danish territory because it's crucial to its national security. But the idea has raised alarms in the semi-autonomous region, particularly after US Vice President Vance announced he'd visit the island. The tour has now been scaled down, but many are still calling it provocative and disrespectful. Greenland is rich in minerals and it's strategically located, but its people say their territory is not for sale. So will this threat further alienate European allies? And how far is Trump willing to go to get what he wants? Katia Lopez-Hodayan has this report.
Greenland is the world's largest island, most of it covered by ice and snow in the Arctic. About 55,000 people live in the semi-autonomous Danish territory. And most recently, U.S. President Donald Trump has doubled down on his threats to take over the island.
We need Greenland for national security and international security. So I think we'll go as far as we have to go. We need Greenland, and the world needs us to have Greenland, including Denmark. Denmark has to have us have Greenland.
Denmark was relieved when Vice President J.D. Vance and his delegation scaled down their visit to Greenland, limiting it instead to touring the U.S. Bideford military base, the only American base in Greenland. And some are questioning the timing of the uninvited visit. It coincides with negotiations to form Greenland's new government and days ahead of its municipal elections.
President Trump is serious. He wants Greenland, so the visit cannot be seen as independent of anything else. No matter how we twist it, there's a completely unacceptable pressure on Greenland, its politicians and its population. But there's also pressure on Denmark.
The island is strategically located between North America and Europe. It's a critical shipping route, particularly as U.S., Chinese, and Russian interests grow in the Arctic. After Trump's remarks, Denmark announced it would increase its military presence in its territory.
We're really excited to be here. Thank you.
Since Trump's son, Donald Jr.'s private visit to the mineral-rich island in January, Trump has consistently talked of annexing Greenland and has urged his residents to join the U.S.
I think they have misread the mood or the room, you can say, in Greenland, and the population in Greenland is more divided than ever before, and I think it's due to many different subjects, but I also think the U.S. interest in Greenland is disrespectful.
Leaders in Greenland have repeatedly said the territory is not for sale, but Trump insists the U.S. will somehow take control. Katia Lopez-Hodayan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
We'll go to our panel in a moment, but first we're joined by Pelle Broberg. He's the leader of the pro-independence Nalirak Party in Greenland. Thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. So firstly, how do people in Greenland feel about this intense US interest in your territory?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. One of the main reasons for the move today is the Danish information and disinformation campaign with regards to Donald Trump and his intentions. Right now, we have a very palpable fear in Greenland because people don't understand international relations. And I think what they tend to forget in the media is exactly what you mentioned, a small, seemingly minor word, but you call us a Danish territory. And this is why the rest of the world thinks we have opted to stay in the Danish kingdom. We have been annexed in 1953 by Denmark. If you look up the definition of annexation, that's what Denmark did in 1953. So we have been trying to work towards independence, and up until recently, most people in Greenland regarded the US as an ally and Denmark as the ones we had to get away from. But because of the phrasing of annexation, which is not a word that has come out of the president's mouth in a connection with Greenland like that, but it has been asked by journalists, phrased in a way that is meant to incite fear and distrust. We are in a position now where a lot of Danes and a lot of Greenlanders living in Greenland is actually believing that that Greenland will be attacked by the US in the coming time. So I think the politicians have been leading the way with inciting fear and mistrust in order to stay in the Danish kingdom.
But is it the Danish politicians, sorry to interrupt Mr. Broberg, but is it the Danish politicians who are inciting fear? Because it's President Donald Trump who has said that the US has to take Greenland one way or another.
Yes, and again, the reason for that phrasing we can only guess. But what we can say is that right now we have seen that Denmark, who cannot even take care of Denmark militarily, is in charge, as they call it, of their territory, Greenland, which is the 12th largest country in the world. And they can't do that. Nobody is denying that. And the reason for the phrasing like that, I think, is meant for deterrence against foreign operators that view Greenland as a vulnerable place in case of independence. So I think most journalists and most, politicians, that if they want facts, they should have talked to the US directly. What is your intentions? But so far, the politicians in Greenland primarily have been preoccupied with inciting fear because we just had an election and we're getting another one in a few days' time.
Well, what do you think the US is?
You
You say that Denmark needs to talk directly to the US about what their intentions are. What do you believe this US administration's intentions are? And while most people in Greenland do support complete independence from Denmark sooner or later, do you think that what the US position is complicating those efforts?
Yes and no. I don't think Denmark should talk to the US. We should talk to the US. Denmark has nothing to say with regard to our future. So it should be Greenland and the Greenlandic politicians talking to the US. And if the politicians are leading the way in demonstrations against the US, that'll be a different or difficult position to have serious talks from. So I think we need to have a conversation in Greenland about the future, what we want, before we let Denmark be involved in any way, shape or form.
That is Pelle Broberg joining us live from Sisimiut in Greenland. Thank you very much for your perspective. We appreciate it.
Quite welcome.
Well, let's bring in our panel. In Copenhagen is Marc Jacobsen, Associate Professor at the Royal Danish Defence College, where he specialises in Arctic security politics and diplomacy. In Paris, Jim Townsend, Senior Fellow at the Centre for a New American Security. He served as President Obama's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO. And in London, Ed Arnold, Research Fellow for European Security at the Royal United Services Institute. That's a defence and security think tank. A very warm welcome to all of you. Marc, let me begin with you and the events of the last week. Why do you think that the US delegation decided to scale back its visit and drop the Second Lady attending this annual dog sled race? Is it because of the opposition from both people and politicians in Greenland and the politicians in Denmark?
Yes, that's a good question, and it's been interesting to follow. I think, as you lay out, there are two main reasons. The first reason is the reaction from Denmark, but primarily from Greenland, saying you are not welcome. This is really a bad timing. We ask you to not to come because right now we don't have a government in place. This is a really be a really bad time to visit. We've seen reactions from the Danish Prime Minister saying that this is unacceptable visit. We saw today the Minister of Defense saying that Donald Trump is threatening the Kingdom of Denmark indirectly, he said. So these are very harsh words in a diplomatic sense of it. So that's one element. The other element is the Greenlanders' reactions, and I think that means more in the US than actually the politicians of Denmark and Greenland. So we saw a couple of weeks ago there were a huge demonstration in Nuuk, a couple of thousand people, which is a lot in a town of just 25,000 people. So a lot of Greenlanders meeting with signs showing "Yankee go home, we're not for sale," led by Muttebey Egede, who is still the premier until Jens Frederik Nielsen, who will take over the charge of Greenland very soon when they have new government in place. So I think because of this reaction from Greenlanders, I think the consulate where the demonstration ended, they've sent back information to Washington, D.C. and saying, oh, this could really risk being bad publicity for us.
Right, so a pretty clear message then. Jim, why then do you think the Vice President, J.D. Vance, decided to join his wife after such strong criticism of the planned visit?
Well, I think the administration doesn't like to look like they're backing away from something. And so because they made all those changes to the vice president's wife going to the dog sledge race, and instead and pull back Mike Waltz as well. So I think the vice president was sent to say, look, we're still in this. We know this is not making you happy, but we want to come. We want to show our flag. And so they made it something dealing just with the base. And, the base is an area where we can fly up there. But it's not a big base. It's not a base that would be a high priority for a new administration. But anyway, this was something that I think kept the idea of going to Greenland in play. It didn't look like we were backing away. And instead, we upped the ante by having the vice president go and, in fact, go to the base.
And Ed, do you think any damage that might have been undone by the US delegation scaling back its visit has been countered by Trump's latest comments, which Jim was saying look very defiant? He said, we need Greenland for international safety and security. We need it. We have to have it. Why is Donald Trump so interested in Greenland?
Yeah, so I don't think it's going to do anything to sort of reduce the growing tensions. And I think it's really important to point out in terms of Trump's view on Greenland, this actually, started in his first term, but you're starting to see a lot more rhetoric. This is the second visit now by a US delegation. His son went previously in January. And I think the diplomatic issues now are really getting quite severe, especially the fact that Trump's, he's not saying that they're Jews force, but he's not ruling it out, and he's very much using that precise language. But in terms of what he's saying also in terms of Greenland and why they need it, he's saying national security, US national security. And if you look at a map, you can understand why. But there's actually also other mechanisms, such as through NATO or the bilateral agreements, that the US could boost security on Greenland, or that NATO could as well. So it's not then following the logic that he's saying, well, the US then has to control the island. So he's going about it very much in the wrong way.
Marc, do you think that this is just about national or even international safety and security? Certainly Russia and China, their influence has been growing in the region, but Donald Trump doesn't seem that concerned about Russian influence, does he? Is he also interested in Greenland's vast untapped mineral resources?
Yes, I think he's interested in Greenland for three reasons. Because of its geostrategic location, it is important in the protection of US national security against threats from outside, especially missiles from Russia, where the shortest distance is via North Pole, via Greenland. Therefore, the Pituffik space base is very important. He's interested in Greenland because of the natural resources, especially rare earth elements, which is very important in all kinds of modern technologies. And then thirdly, and I think most importantly, it's actually about his political ambitions, his personal ambitions about making America great again. It's not just about the economy, it's about actually expanding the territory of the US.
Jim, is there any legal basis for the US taking Greenland?
Well, I mean, there is a legal way in which a group of people can ask to become part of the United States. We've seen that for Alaska, Hawaii, back in the 19th century when we were adding states. But in this modern world that we're in right now, it would be something that the Greenlandic people would have to come to Washington and say, we would like to be considered as a state. And then Washington would have to look at this. The Congress would have to look at this. This is something that, doesn't happen all the time. And so, it's something that is just so out of context for the current day. I think you'd have to dust off some old law books to find out what the legalities are and what the process would be should Greenland want to do something like this.
And Marc, Greenland doesn't want to do anything like that, does it? I mean, we just heard from a member of one of Greenland's political parties, and they say that people in Greenland want to have dialogue with the US, that some even see it as more of an ally than they do Denmark. But people in Greenland don't want to be part of the US, do they?
No, it's a clear no. For the far majority of Greenlanders doesn't want to become the 51st state of the US. What is the main goal for 4 out of 5 parties in Greenland is independence. So it's to become a state sometime in the future. So that's a clear no to the US. That said, Greenland is looking for new investments. And what I stated before about the rare earth elements and possible investments from the US, that's already possible within the current arrangement. So they published last year a foreign policy strategy where actually the relationship to the US played a big role. And we see this summer that there's a new air link opening between Nuuk and New York. So actually there's a great interest from Greenland in building closer relationships, especially business-wise, to the US. But the general attitude from Greenlanders towards US and Americans during the past month has changed for the worse, unfortunately.
And Ed, do you think that there is something that Greenland, Denmark, even the Europeans, where they can find common ground with Trump and work on things, on commercial interests, whether it's on the shipping that's greatly increasing through the Arctic Circle or the expansion of building ports and harbours? Is there common ground that Europe, that Denmark, that Greenland can find with Trump that would make him happy, or do you think that nothing short of taking the territory of Greenland will satisfy him at this stage?
I think there could have been common ground, which would have been through a period of dialogue to talk about the security concerns that the US and Trump had with Greenland. The Danish government has sort of changed its posture again and started to do more in terms of security, and Greenland sort of to show sort of that approach to the US. But I think the language that Trump is now using makes that very, very difficult. And this can't just be seen in isolation in terms of the US and Greenland, because it's also a very similar situation to the US and Canada. And both Denmark and Canada are NATO allies. So actually it's starting to bring the rest of Europe in, and there's other issues surrounding the transatlantic relationship at the moment, particularly in terms of tariffs. But in terms of a diplomatic issue, I think that both the duality of the situation in Canada and Greenland is actually probably going to be the biggest diplomatic issue, certainly in the immediate term.
And Jim, as we've been saying, Trump hasn't ruled out the use of force to bring Greenland under Washington's control. But can a NATO member use military force on an ally's territory?
Well, that is such a painful thing to even think about. The United States doing something along those lines to another NATO ally is just a horror. That's a nightmare. I don't see that happening in this situation, no matter what the rhetoric is coming out of Donald Trump. I think it's a lot of bombast on his point. Maybe he's trying to bully, he's trying to intimidate. I do not see the United States using military force against another ally, particularly Greenland and Denmark. That would just be, I just think that just could not and would not happen.
Do you see Donald Trump increasing the military presence in Greenland?
Well, if he does increase it, it will not be in order to take over Greenland. If there's an increase, it might be at the base. If the base is going to be taking on other missions, I know that Denmark has talked about building a facility to handle drones for maritime surveillance, maybe on the East Coast. If we might be part of something like that, just to keep an eye out, working with Denmark to keep an eye out on the Arctic. But I don't see a large U.S. military presence coming about, and I certainly don't see one that would be there to take over Greenland.
Marc, do you think that the European Union, that NATO has been outspoken enough of its support of Denmark or criticism of this US administration's position? Donald Trump even met with NATO Secretary General Marc Rutte earlier this month, and he said that NATO might have to get involved, to which Rutte replied that, "I don't want to drag NATO into the debate." That's all he had to say.
That's a good question regarding how far you should go with the rhetoric. I think there's been steps building up as we've seen the statements being repeated from the US again and again. That said, I think it's clever from the Danish side to make this an issue not between Denmark, Greenland, and the US, but between EU and the US, which will make Denmark stand more firmly, and it could in a competition or a conflict with the US, it could hurt the US more. That said, I think we're still far from any conflict, and perhaps a solution could actually be to enhance NATO presence in the Arctic, perhaps in Greenland, although Marc Rutte didn't want to discuss it in the White House when he visited it. But that could perhaps be part of the solution.
And in the meantime, Ed, Trump has suggested he would impose tariffs on Denmark if it resists his offer to purchase the island. Do you think Denmark should be worried about an economic impact?
Yeah, I think Denmark should be worried about an economic impact, and also Europe. I mean, the Trump administration, second Trump administration, has been using tariffs as a tool of coercion, ultimately, and they're starting to, or they perceive their success, so they're more likely to then use that lever. And as Marc said, that will actually bring in particularly the EU on the Danish side. So again, I don't think you can divorce this sort of security issue around with Denmark, the US, and Greenland from the wider issues that the US and Europe, both EU and NATO, are going to have in the future. And I think you're going to see increased pressure. And I think particularly within the NATO context and security, I mean, the Hague summit this year, which will be Trump's first NATO summit since 2018. I mean, that is going to be a big event, and that is where the Europeans need to get collectively a view on this and ultimately understand how to deal with the Trump administration when he's making such demands on allies in terms of Denmark and also Canada.
Jim, how do you think Greenland, Denmark, Europe should be dealing with this Trump administration when it comes to this issue, especially given that J.D. Vance is visiting just a few days after that leaked conversation showed him saying that he can't stand European freeloading, he said?
Well, I think Denmark and Greenland so far has been handling it pretty well, because I think what you don't want to do is get on in the crosshairs of Donald Trump. You don't want to say something, do something, stage something that makes Trump look bad, because then he'll come after you. And I think we saw that when Zelensky was in the Oval Office with the president, and they began this horrible squabble. I think it's a matter of staying cool, being firm, and not being silent, but trying not to make this into a major cause in the news media so that it gets on Trump's radar and he feels he's got to say something to top what was said by Denmark or Greenland. And you have this escalation of rhetoric. I think this being cool and letting time go by and then trying to work behind the scenes quietly in terms of dialogue, as my colleagues have said, discussions, trying to see what will help assuage Donald Trump's issues and problems. There are solutions that don't involve the military, and I think discussions behind the scenes quietly can find those.
Marc, do you see cooler heads prevailing here? Are we on course not only for increased divisions between Russia and the European Arctic states, but those European Arctic states and the US itself here?
Yeah, I agree very much. It's important to keep a cool head and to use the diplomatic channels. I think that it's important to talk to the people behind the scenes who have the ear of Donald Trump, to actually tell him what are the actual facts. Is it really in the interest of the US to invade Greenland, if that's his thought? So yes, I agree. Keep a cool head, as we learned from Mexico. Apparently, that she says that's important to keep a cool head and not go to the same level as Donald Trump. So I think we can learn from Mexico.
And Ed, we have seen that though from Greenlandic, from Danish politicians too, but is it getting the results they want when, as we mentioned, Donald Trump once again said on the eve of this visit by the US administration, we have to take Greenland?
Well, I'd agree with the previous statement that this is about sort of expectation and escalation management, and I think thus far the right approach has prevailed. But it's almost certainly likely that this is going to build in terms of pressure. And I think that the best course of action for the Danish government, that has been said previously, is really strengthen numbers through their allies, in terms of the European allies on the side of NATO, and also in terms of the EU. They are fully behind Denmark. But actually what you've seen at a bilateral basis, so you've had states like France and Germany speaking out more on Denmark's behalf. The UK's actually been quite quiet. So I think also the Danes can do more bilaterally with their allies in order to sort of strengthen that messaging. And there's a lot of European leaders going over to the US on a variety of issues at the moment in terms of security and trade. And I think that making sure that that they start to mention that in terms of their own discussions and support of an ally would also help a lot.
Thank you to all of our guests, Marc Jacobsen in Copenhagen, Jim Townsend in Paris, and Ed Arnold in London, and Pelle Broberg, who joined us earlier. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the entire team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.